The Vikings were a fearsome and brutal group of people who were known for raiding and gaining control of many villages throughout Europe and North America during the 8th to 11th centuries, a time period which was later called the Viking Age. Along the way, they spread their power, culture, and way of life. With all their achievements, it is arguable to say that the Vikings created an empire. But the question is, was it actually an empire? And if it wasn't, to what extent did they establish one? The Vikings, one of the most fearsome and brutal groups of people to ever walk the earth. Throughout the time that historians call the Viking Age, which spanned from the 8th to 11th centuries, they raided and destroyed hundreds of villages over Europe, as well as killing and enslaving those who got in the way. By the end of the Viking Age, the Vikings had managed to establish control over parts of England, Ireland, France, Russia, and Iceland, as well as other regions in Europe and North America. With all of their achievements, it is arguable to say that the Vikings created an empire. This is a topic that historians have been debating for years. The Vikings definitely met some of the criteria of an empire. They governed large amounts of territory, had an extremely large and strong military force, and held power over other states. In fact, it seems that the only criteria that the Vikings did not meet is that of having a centralized leadership. But the question is, did this one criteria prevent them from becoming a full-fledged empire? The answer is yes. Without a centralized leader or government, the Vikings became a fragmented society. This meant that each Viking clan had its own laws and values, which may have differed from other clans. Eventually, the clans became hostile towards one another, and it took centuries for them to finally become united. But by the time this happened, the Viking Age was over. One of the most significant Viking achievements was the amount of territory they gained throughout the course of the Viking Age. From their original homelands of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, they managed to expand their territory to include parts of England, Ireland, France, Iceland, Russia, and North America. The exact reasons for their expansion are unknown, but historians believe that it could have to do with strains on resources, imbalances in trading with the Europeans, and overall political instability. The Viking expansion was large and affected many of the people who lived in Europe and North America at the time, and it is one of the reasons why some people believe that the Vikings established an empire. Over the years, archaeologists have uncovered large amounts of evidence of the Vikings' presence in various locations throughout Europe and North America. These mainly consisted of coins, weapons, and combs, as well as other artifacts. We know these are Viking artifacts for two reasons. The first is that some artifacts, such as gravestones and coins, have been inscripted with Viking runes. The second is that identical copies of some of these artifacts have been found in multiple locations around the regions that the Vikings have been said to have been to. Both of these would suggest that artifacts were a Viking creation, and therefore that they visited several locations around Europe and North America. Another form of evidence to prove that the Vikings had expanded were the Anglo-Saxon chronicles. These were a series of manuscripts developed in the early Viking Age that highlighted some of the most important events in Anglo-Saxon England. Multiple of these events were centered around the Viking expansion throughout England and the British Isles. Since these were eyewitness accounts of Viking expansion, we can be assured that it actually did happen. A major criteria of an empire that the Vikings did not meet is that of a centralized leader or government that has imperial power over the territory it rules. The Vikings were made up of a series of different clans, each of which had its own leader, called a congrue, or a king. At one time, there could be multiple congrues within the Viking homelands. This often resulted in fighting among kings, political instability, and the fragmentation of the Viking people. This hostility between clans continued throughout the course of the Viking Age. Some historians have even said that it could be potentially one of the reasons why some clans left Scandinavia in the first place. A specific piece of evidence that can be used to prove that there was no centralized leadership is a Viking coin. Typically, ancient coins were engraved with the face or symbol of the leader that ruled when the coin was made. When coins that are tied to a specific empire come from the same time period, they are usually of similar or identical design and have the same ruler symbol on them. An example of an empire where this is the case is the Romans. However, this could not be said for the Vikings. Archaeologists have uncovered Viking coins that come from Viking territories in the same time period, but have different ruler symbols on them. This would suggest that there was no centralized dominant ruler or government. This information supports the hypothesis made by historians that each Viking clan had its own ruler, therefore that they were a divided and fragmented society. A further demonstration that suggests no centralized leadership is the significant lack of evidence, relics, or historical script to support the notion that there was in fact a centralized entity which ruled and directed the clans. In the cases of other empires, such as the Romans, archaeologists have found artifacts, architecture, and documentation over all the empire's territories that have linked back to specific rulers of the empire. The same has not been found of the Vikings. This would lead us to believe the opposite, that they were a divided and fragmented society. The Vikings had the potential to become one of the strongest empires ever to be seen in history. They had large amounts of power and influence, vast amounts of territory, and the ability to expand their borders if they wished. The only thing that stood in their way was the lack of unity between the clans, which could have been fixed if the Vikings had a centralized leader. Imagine what the Vikings could have done if they were united. The army they would have built would have been unstoppable, and it would have created one of the most powerful empires the earth has ever seen. But it didn't happen, and the rest of the world is left to imagine what could have been.